Hello and welcome to Rolling with Two. I'm Will, and with me, as always, is the statuesque one herself,
Sarah.
And today we're doing a two-player perspective and accessibility for Chiseled. Sarah, tell us a bit about this game.
All right. Chiseled is a deck deconstruction game in which players use a shared set of tools to whittle away cards in their deck to make the best sculpture they can and hopefully please the critics. All right, Will, so do the rules change for two players?
So oddly enough, when it comes to 2 and 3 players, you're playing the standard rules. It's actually 1 in 4 players that have augmented things that look for this icon to do something. Yeah. So for a 2-player game, you're playing the base rules.
Yeah, so there's no changes for 2 players.
No, and there's no bot. However, you could always take your Nanoman and have him stand out there as an example model that you're sculpting. And just say, I'm sculpting a Nanoman.
Yeah, you could.
Yes.
All right, so let's take a look at any issues with a 2-player experience. Honestly, for the main game, we didn't identify any.
No, it's solidly throughout.
I think that comes through in the rules, since 2 and 3 players are the standard way to play. It's a really good 2-player game.
Yes. Now, there are issues when it comes to the expansion.
Yeah, waxed marble.
The waxed marble. Now, the way it works is you take the deck of waxed marble, there's 24 cards, and you split it in half, 12 and 12.
And that's for a 2-player
This is for a 2-player game. From there, you start manipulating them and putting them in each other's discard piles and doing whatever it is you do while sculpting. Now, the problem is, at the end of the game, it looks at totals of each player's. One person is going to get a lot of points. The other person's going to lose a lot of points. And that massive swing just makes that component very, very unpleasant to play with.
Right. So just be a little more specific. It counts who has the most. That person loses 1 point per card. Who has the least, in this case, because there's only 2 players, would gain 1 point for each card. And so the best case scenario is if both players tied, both players would lose points for the cards that they have in their deck.
Yeah, it feels mean and unbalanced. I wouldn't recommend it for a 2-player game. Now, once you have more players, then that becomes a more interesting play space.
Yeah.
But for 2 players, I'd probably avoid the expansion because of how solid the base game is for a 2-player count.
Yep.
Now, what does it do right?
Well, it's pretty tactical gameplay as you go back and forth. There's this row of tools. You're going to use one on your turn. Then the next person goes. They use one on their turn. And because it goes back and forth, it's back to you. So you can gauge better on what tools might get used and when. And with the way the game is set up, the last person for the row, there will always be one left, and the person who gets that has to use it.
Yeah.
So
it can still be a bit mean.
It can still be a bit mean.
Because you don't want to do what that tool tells you to do.
Most likely.
Yeah, so there are tools that you're like, I'm not sure I want to play with this. Fortunately, there are a lot of tools in the box.
So if there is a tool you don't like, or everyone at the table doesn't like, you just don't play with that tool. You can play with a different tool.
Yeah, my suggestion is take all the tools, have players draft them.
Yeah.
And then once you get to the required number of tools to play with, and the tools are the actions that you'll use to manipulate your various deck, discard, trash, and all that sort of thing.
Yep.
So it is how you play the game, and once an action is taken, it's flipped down, and you keep going until all of them are flipped down, and then all of them get flipped up again.
Yep.
So 2-player, heavy tactical aspect, other player counts, less so.
Correct.
So,
yep.
It does that very well. What else does it do well?
That's actually the main thing that we identified. Because again, we didn't really identify anything bad for a 2-player experience, and that is what it does the best. Everything else this is just the good. It's a game. The game aspects don't matter on player count, I guess I should say.
So, accessibility.
Okay, so some of the text doesn't have the best contrast. And the worst offender would be the scrap card has a -3 in the corner, and it's like a light gray on a very busy but light background, so it's just really hard to read. The good news is all scrap is worth -3.
The funny thing is, it doesn't even say in the rules that scrap is worth -3.
Oh no, it never does anywhere in the rules.
Which we didn't realize. And then Sarah's like looking at the rules and she's like, I don't know how much scrap is worth. And I'm like, why don't you look at a scrap card? And it's like, because it's not in the rules. And like, just look at the scrap card. And she goes, oh, it's -3.
Right.
Okay.
So I guess that's a small minor failing of the rule book. But I mean, the rule book's good everywhere else. It just literally never said. I think in the scoring, it just says you lose points for scrap.
Yes.
And I'm like, but how much?
Yeah.
How much?
I need to know these things.
Yeah. So that was a contrast. So some of the contrast with the text in the background is not great. Really what a bigger problem is the text is really small on most of the cards. And this is bad on the tools and the critic cards because those are in the middle of the table. And you're supposed to look at them from a distance. Well, thankfully, since it was just the two of us, I pulled everything really close. I still ended up having to pick up the cards like almost every single time until I like started to really learn, okay, this tool does that, this tool does that. But like the critics, you don't look at them as often. So if you want to remind yourself what a critic does, you have to pick it up to look at it.
Critics are important because they're the goals that you're striving for to make your sculpture worth just that much more.
Yeah, exactly. So what it does right, though, the icons are really distinct for each sculpture part. You've got a torso and a head and a hand. I think that's it? Head, hand,
And scrap.
And then the scrap. So
Unless you're playing with wax. Then
well, yeah. But even with the wax, they're very distinct icons. So that's not a problem. Each color has a corresponding shape. Honestly, for me, I just have real trouble remembering the colors because it's like silver and gold and onyx. And for some reason, it's just those words don't stick in my head. So we use the shapes, which are
square, circle, and
diamond.
Yeah.
The good news is, because that's double coated, you can use whichever one works for you.
Now, one of the things that I really, really like is cognitively, when it comes to scoring, you have to figure out, what's in your deck and your discard pile to figure out how much your statue's worth. The whole time, though, you're throwing this trash out, so it's also can be easily organized throughout the course of the game. Now, if your brain works better thinking about what scrap is rather than what is actually in your deck, you can take the player board, flip it over, and it will tell you the score using that metric instead.
Right. Yeah, that is really amazing that the designer recognized that people think about things in different ways. And since you're counting up how many of each thing is in your sculpture, which is your deck and your discard pile combined, well, you can also think about it as how much did you take out of your deck? And I don't know, maybe it's just, I don't know, if it's just us. I like to look at the trash, but then we organize the trash as we play the game so that we have a pile of heads and a torsos and a pile of hands and scrap. So that works.
Now, this is doable because every game, your deck starts out the same for every player. You have 18 scrap, 9 torsos, 9 heads, 9 hands.
Yep.
And based on what is left, will give you different points. So, yeah, it's rather ingenious in the fact that as I'm sculpting my deck, I can look at it, what's not in it or what's in it. Both work just fine.
Yep. And then lastly, there's a lot of open information. So if you do have any trouble with anything, you can generally get help from other people around the table. It's like, hey, I can't read what that tool is. Can you read it to me? And then when it comes for cards, you're supposed to keep them secret. I just read them to his cards to him.
Yeah, when it's my turn, just show my hand.
Right, and the only thing is at the end of his turn, he starts drawing cards one at a time. If one of them's a scrap, then we know we don't have to move the critics along, because that's the timer of the game.
Yes. The reason why that also doesn't really matter is because so far, all the tools I see don't mess with the other player's hand.
Right.
So,
I mean, at most, I could choose to use a tool that I think you might want to use on your turn, but this is not a hate I mean, it's not a hate drafting type of game.
You're too busy doing
Yeah,
your
you
thing.
need to do your own thing. So if you're hate drafting someone else because you're helping them by reading them their cards, maybe you really just should play a different game.
Yes.
Or play that game because the other person's going to win because you're not paying attention to your sculpture. So that's everything for accessibility.
Yes. So for 2 players, would you recommend Chiseled?
I generally would, especially if you like that tactical gameplay of going back and forth. You'll just have to ignore the little expansion, but the base game is still really solid for what it is for a 2-player game.
Yeah, 2-player tactical, that's what this thing delivers, and it delivers it in spades. So if that's your jam, then this is your jelly roll, because jam and jelly rolls go together for some reason.
Sounds good.
Well, don't you put, I mean, jelly in jam, jelly roll?
I guess so.
Yes, jelly roll. So for accessibility.
Yes, I mean, for the most part, the small text is going to be a problem for some people, but again, it's on the face-up cards, so you can get help from somebody else.
Yeah, everything I saw that could be a problem was easily overcome.
Yeah.
And so there's no real issue here for accessibility.
Agreed.
That will do it for us here at Rolling with Two. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or just want to share a sculpture, you can reach out on the various social media platforms at
Rolling with Two, that's TWO. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And on YouTube, please like and subscribe.
And why would you ever sculpt with just one game when you can be rolling with two?
Two.
I'm not sure that worked.
I don't know.
Chiseled.